A millionaire CEO took his twin daughters on a blind date, but instead of arriving in a suit and luxury car, he showed up pretending to be broke, hoping to find someone who would love the real him. Not the power, not the money, but the man behind it all. Yet everything changed when the woman across from him did something completely unexpected that forced him to reveal the truth he was hiding. Will she walk away or accept the man behind the mask? If this story grabs your heart already, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from. And be sure to watch until the very end. Graham Westwood stood before the wide glass windows of his penthouse, a man imprisoned by luxury. The city beyond him stretched endlessly, glowing with life and success. It was the kind of view most would dream of, yet all he could feel tonight was an overwhelming sense of silence. Not the peaceful kind, but the one that reminded him how far he had drifted from the things that truly mattered. Inside the vast room, two little girls giggled softly, brushing their doll's hair and arranging napkins on a miniature tea table. Eloise and Ava, his daughters, were only 6 but carried a warmth that melted the coldness of the marble floors and expensive furniture. They didn't know their father was considered one of the most powerful men in the country. They just knew him as the man who made pancake faces on Sundays and carried them up the stairs on his shoulders when they were too sleepy to walk. Graham watched them now, their innocence piercing through his exhaustion. He had spent the past 10 years building his empire, acquiring companies, landing in business magazines, and delivering keynote speeches. But not once in those 10 years had he experienced the kind of honesty he found in their bedtime stories and quiet hugs. The silence was broken when Eloise looked up from her play. "Daddy," she said curiously, "are we really going to meet a lady tonight?" Graham smiled, kneeling beside them. "Yes, sweetheart, but she doesn't know who I really am. She just thinks I'm Graham, a regular dad." Ava tilted her head. "Why don't you tell her?" He sighed gently. "Because sometimes, people only see what they want to see. And I want to know if someone can like me for who I am without the suits and the company name." Eloise leaned in and whispered, "Will we like her?" "I hope so," he replied, brushing her hair aside. They got ready quietly that evening. Graham wore soft jeans and a navy sweater that hadn't seen the outside of his closet in years. He traded his usual leather shoes for simple brown ones and tucked his wallet into his back pocket like any ordinary man. The girls wore matching dresses with white lace ribbons, their eyes bright with curiosity and excitement. Their car wasn't the usual sleek black limousine. It was a rented sedan, just a little dusty, just a little imperfect. Graham drove with the windows partly down, letting the city air carry away the tension in his chest. The restaurant was a hidden gem, nestled between an old bookstore and a florist shop that smelled of roses and earth. It had wooden tables, candlelight, and warm walls that whispered stories of shared meals and first kisses. Graham felt something inside him loosen. She was already there when they arrived. Sodie, she sat by the window, sipping water, her fingers playing nervously with the edge of her napkin. Her strawberry blonde hair shimmered in the soft glow, and her green eyes lifted when she saw them. Graham walked over slowly, holding each daughter's hand. "Hi," he said, his voice steady but unsure. "I'm Graham. These are my daughters, Eloise and Ava." Sodie smiled and crouched down beside the girls. "Hello, beautiful ladies. I love your ribbons," they giggled, instantly warming to her. Sodie stood and extended her hand to Graham. Her grip was firm but gentle. "It's nice to meet you." They sat at a table near the fireplace. The girls ordered spaghetti and lemonade, and Graham and Sodie shared a plate of roasted vegetables and bread. Conversation flowed like a quiet stream. Sodie asked the girls about their favorite animals and cartoons. Graham watched with surprise as they opened up so easily, sharing stories, laughing at her jokes, and asking questions of their own. As dinner continued, Graham found himself relaxing. He told stories, not of boardroom deals or corporate takeovers, but of playground disasters and pancake experiments gone wrong. Sodie listened with full attention, sometimes leaning forward, her face glowing with amusement. There were moments when their eyes met, lingering for a breath too long. There was something kind in her, something real that made Graham's carefully constructed world feel small in comparison. And though he had rehearsed ways to avoid the subject of his identity, he realized he didn't need them. She didn't ask. She didn't press. Instead, she asked him what scared him the most. He hesitated before answering. "Losing the parts of me that matter. My girls, my heart, my ability to laugh when I spill coffee or miss the train." She smiled gently. "You sound like someone who's been through more than most people think." He nodded. "Maybe, Ava suddenly leaned forward. Do you like Daddy? Sadie blinked, surprised. Then she looked at Graham, her eyes twinkling. I think your daddy is very nice. The girls beamed. Graham felt his heart tighten. They shared dessert, a single plate of chocolate cake that the girls attacked with little spoons. Sadie offered them the cherry on top, and they gave it back to her in return. Graham watched, feeling something settle inside him, not an achievement, not a goal, something simpler. A beginning. When it was time to go, Sadie walked them to the car. She bent down to hug the girls, who hugged her back without hesitation. Will we see you again? Eloise asked. Sadie looked at Graham. That's up to your dad. He nodded. Yes. I'd really like that. She smiled. So would I. He opened the car door and helped the girls in, then turned to her once more. Thank you. For what? She asked. For not asking about anything that doesn't matter. Sadie gave him a small smile that said more than words ever could. Sometimes the things that matter are the ones people forget to see. As Graham drove home that night, the girls soon asleep in the back seat, he found himself smiling into the darkness. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about profit margins or deadlines. He was thinking about green eyes, soft laughter, and a woman who didn't need to be impressed, only understood. And perhaps, just perhaps, he had finally begun to understand himself. The next morning, sunlight filtered through the curtains, casting golden stripes across Graham's bedroom floor. He sat on the edge of his bed, still dressed in the jeans and sweater from the night before. His hands rested loosely in his lap, his thoughts far from the towering city outside the windows. The girls were still asleep in the next room, their soft breathing the only sound breaking the morning hush. Graham had spent years mastering every detail of his life. His meetings were scheduled down to the minute. His calendar had no blank spaces. His wardrobe was chosen for him. His phone never stopped vibrating with requests and reminders. Yet now, after a single dinner with a woman who knew nothing about who he was, the ground beneath him felt completely unfamiliar. He had not felt this unsettled in years, and somehow, that was comforting. In the kitchen, he poured a cup of coffee and sat at the marble island, staring at the cup as if it held answers. The smell reminded him of quieter mornings, the ones before success had wrapped him in gold and steel. Back then, he had dreamed of building something meaningful. Now he was wondering if that dream had ever included a life that actually felt like his. His phone buzzed. It was a message from Sadie. Thank you for last night. I haven't laughed like that in a long time. He smiled, fingers hesitating over the keys. Would you like to meet again? Maybe just the two of us. The reply came quickly. I'd like that. They agreed to meet at a park just outside the city, away from the noise and the nameplates. Graham arrived early, wearing the same jeans, the same sweater, trying to be the man he was with her, not the one people expected. The air was cool, leaves beginning to fall around the quiet paths and wooden benches. Sadie arrived wearing a soft brown coat and a blue scarf that framed her face gently. Her hair was pulled back, revealing a face more expressive than he remembered. She smiled the moment she saw him, not the kind of smile you give to a stranger, but one you offer to someone who makes you feel safe. Hi, she said, a little breathless. I wasn't sure you'd come. Why wouldn't I? He asked. Genuinely surprised, she shrugged. I don't know. Most men don't like women who ask too many questions or offer to pay. He laughed softly. Well, I'm not most men. They walked along a path that curved around a small lake. Ducks floated lazily on the surface, and children chased each other through the grass nearby. The world felt distant, smaller and kinder in this place. I was married once, Sadie said after a while, her voice steady but soft. Graham looked at her, surprised but grateful for her honesty. He was charming in public, she continued. Had the right job, the right friends. But in private, he liked to keep me in my place. I spent too many years thinking his coldness was normal. When I finally left, I promised myself I wouldn't fall for money again, or power, or titles. Graham stopped walking. What? She asked, noticing the tension in his shoulders. He hesitated. You said you promised not to fall for power again. And here I am, still trying to figure out how to tell you who I really am. She looked at him carefully. What do you mean? He shook his head. Not yet, I want to stay in this moment a little longer, without the weight of everything else. She studied him for a long time, then nodded. Okay. They sat on a bench, watching as the wind stirred the leaves. A silence fell between them, not awkward, but full of questions neither of them knew how to ask. You're different, she said finally. You listen. You talk about your daughters like they're the best part of your life. You laugh at yourself. He smiled. That's because They are, and I've had enough of pretending otherwise. She leaned against his shoulder, and they stayed that way until the sun dipped low behind the trees. That evening, Graham returned home with a heart heavier than before, but in a way that felt meaningful. He tucked the girls into bed and kissed their foreheads. He watched them sleep, their little hands curled against their cheeks, and wondered what kind of world he wanted them to grow up in. He poured himself a drink and stood at the window again. The skyline had not changed. The buildings were still tall, the lights still blinding, but something inside him was shifting. He remembered her words about power, about control, about being small in the presence of someone bigger, and he knew that the truth he carried could ruin everything or rebuild something stronger. He picked up his phone and stared at her number. Not yet, but soon. The following weekend, they met again, this time at a local fair that Saudi said she visited every year. She wore denim jeans and a white blouse, her hair tied up, her smile easy. Graham bought cotton candy for the girls, who squealed at the sight of the colorful booths and carousel. Horses.sad. I watched the girls with admiration. They're so full of joy. They save it all for me, he said, laughing. You're a good father, Graham. He glanced at her. You don't even know my last name. I don't need to, she replied. Not yet. They watched the twins play ring toss, their tiny hands flinging plastic hoops into the air. Graham felt Sadie's hand brush his, and he took it, surprised by how natural it felt. Later that night, as they sat on a bench with two sleepy girls on their laps, Sadie leaned into him. I've spent a lot of time trying to stay away from people like you. He looked at her, confused. What do you mean? I don't know who you were before this, but you walk like someone who's carried too much. You speak like someone used to being obeyed, and when you pause before answering, it feels like there's a name you're holding back. Graham swallowed hard. She turned her head. But I also see how your girls look at you. How you bend down to tie their shoes and wipe ice cream off their cheeks. That kind of love can't be faked. He wanted to tell her everything right then. The truth sat on his tongue, burning, but her eyes were already closing, her head resting lightly against his arm. So he held her there beneath the fairground lights, wondering how long he could protect the truth before it set them both free. Graham had rehearsed it in his head over 100 times. The moment he would finally tell her, the words, the pause, the breath between her response and his silence, he thought he would feel relief, maybe even pride, revealing the name behind the ordinary man he had pretended to be. But the closer he got to saying it, the more the thought twisted in his chest like a tight knot pulling against itself. For the next few days, he walked through meetings and video conferences like a man living two lives. One was polished, commanding, and neatly folded in a suit with perfect stitching. The other was unraveled, barefoot on a bench in a city park, hand in hand with a woman who spoke to him like she had known him for years and not minutes. He found himself listening less in meetings, staring at screens but seeing her instead, her green eyes, her curious smile, the faint lines around her lips that appeared when she laughed too hard. He remembered how she had offered to pay for their dinner, how that small gesture had pierced through the heavy armor he'd worn for so long. No one had ever offered him something without expecting something in return. It was that moment that stayed with him, and it was that moment that gave him the courage to plan what came next. He invited her to dinner, not at a bistro or a hidden cafe, but at his place, his real place. The penthouse with the floor-to-ceiling windows and walls that echoed when the girls were at school. He didn't tell her where they were going. He only asked if she would let him cook. You cook, she had replied through a message. Once, he had answered, you'll be my second attempt. Now, the evening had arrived. The dining table was set simply. No crystal, no silver, no folded napkins. Just white plates, warm lighting, and the faint sound of soft jazz playing in the background. The girls were spending the weekend with their grandmother, and the space felt strangely quiet without them. Graham checked the time. His palms were sweating. Then the doorbell rang. When he opened it, Sadie stood there in a casual black dress, her eyes wide as she looked past him into the apartment. This is your place, she asked, stepping inside slowly. He nodded, then motioned toward the kitchen. Don't judge the food. I read the recipe 5 times and still think I got the garlic wrong. Sadie chuckled as she walked further in, her eyes taking in the clean lines, the expensive furniture, the view that stretched endlessly across the glowing city. She turned to him. So, this is where you really live? Graham swallowed. The air felt too heavy. Yes, and this is who you really are. Almost. He led her to the table, pulling out a chair for her before sitting down across from her. The meal was simple, just roasted chicken and vegetables, but she took a bite and smiled. This is delicious. He laughed. That's very kind. For a while they talked about her art class, about the boy who spilled paint on the floor and insisted it was a modern masterpiece, about the old woman who came every week and only painted bluebirds. Graham listened, grateful for her words, wishing the moment would never end. But then the silence came. She looked at him, and her voice dropped. "Graham, who are you?" He looked down at his hands, then lifted his eyes to hers. "My name is Graham Westwood." The silence that followed was not sharp, it was soft. A silence full of confusion, history, and pieces clicking together all at once. Sodhi sat back in her chair, blinking. The Graham Westwood, the one with the real estate company, the magazine covers, the gala speeches. He nodded slowly. Yes. She didn't speak for a moment. She reached for her glass of water and held it in both hands, staring at the ripples. "I didn't tell you right away," he continued, "because I've spent too much of my life being seen for what I own instead of who I am, and I didn't want that with you." Her voice came slowly. "I dated someone once, Michael. He worked in finance. He talked about you like you were a legend, told stories about parties and meetings with you. He wanted to be you." Graham looked at her, his breath caught in his throat. "He was cruel," she said softly. "Charming in public, cold in private. He made me feel like I was lucky to be chosen." A bitter smile touched her lips. "I ran from that world. I promised myself never again. Never another man who lived in glass towers and counted people as currency." She stood up then, walking to the window, arms crossed tightly. "And now here you are." Graham followed slowly. "I'm not him. I know," she whispered. "I brought my daughters with me to that first date because I wanted you to see the part of me that matters, the part I trust. I've built a life people envy, but I've never had someone I could talk to without wondering what they wanted from me." She turned to face him. "I offered to pay because I didn't want to be seen as someone looking for a savior," she said. "I wanted to feel equal." "You are," he said quietly. Tears filled her eyes. "I didn't want this to be real, because if it is, it means I have to choose, and I'm scared." Graham stepped closer, his voice trembling. "You're not the only one." She looked at him for a long time, then she reached for his hand. "I need to know," she said. "If I stay, if we try this, can we be two people in love without the noise, without the cameras, without the world trying to define us?" He nodded. "Yes, but it will be hard. People will talk, they'll make assumptions." "Let them," she said. "I only care about what you show me in the quiet moments." He took her hand and pressed it to his chest. "Then this is yours." She rested her forehead against his, her breath warm on his skin. "I didn't come here looking for a name," she whispered. "I came looking for a heart that wasn't afraid to be honest." Graham closed his eyes, and for the first time in years he let the truth live out loud. For a while, things were beautiful. Graham and Sodhi began spending more time together, not just in the quiet moments of dimly lit apartments or secret parks, but in the parts of each other's lives that mattered. Graham took Sodhi and the girls to the local farmer's market. They walked between booths holding hands and shared cinnamon bread while the twins pointed out puppies and flowers. Sodhi invited him into her world, into her classroom of messy paintbrushes, into her favorite cafe that always smelled like roasted almonds, into the community center where she helped underprivileged kids express themselves through art, met the people who mattered to her, her best friend Leela who asked every question with fierce protectiveness, her neighbor Tomas who grew tomatoes on the fire escape and insisted Graham learn to make real pasta sauce, and Sodhi met his people, two though fewer, quieter, carefully chosen, his mother who lived by the sea and still called him every Sunday, his driver, Nathan, who had known him since his 20s and treated the twins like his own granddaughters for once. Graham allowed his two worlds to breathe in the same room, and for a while, it worked, but the world outside rarely allows peace. Without a price tag, it started with a photograph, a candid shot taken at the park, Sodhi on the swings with the girls, Graham pushing Ava gently, his face open, smiling, unaware. The image appeared on a popular social media page, accompanied by a caption that sparked curiosity, then conversation, then judgment. Graham Westwood's new love. Sources say she's an art teacher with no industry ties. Graham read the headline at his desk while the twins colored in his office. His heart tightened, not because of what it said, but because of what it would do. He looked up just in time to see Sodhi walk in, holding coffee for both of them. He didn't even need to say anything. She had already seen it. "Do you think they'll stop at that?" she asked, placing the cups down carefully. "No," he replied. "They never stop. They smell mystery like blood." Sodhi sat on the edge of the couch, her fingers curled around the hem of her coat. "And what happens when they come for me? For my students? For my past?" Graham sat beside her, reaching for her hand. Then we shut the door. But will it be enough? There was no easy answer. The world they were part of now did not respect boundaries. It chased them down, squeezed out every drop of speculation, and twisted truth until it served its appetite. Days passed. Rumors spread. Blogs called her a social climber. Anonymous voices whispered that she had planned this from the beginning, that she had known who he was all along, that she had set a trap. Graham fired the marketing firm that leaked his dinner reservation. He called in favors, pulled stories off platforms, filed cease letters, but the damage had already begun. At the community center, 3 parents pulled their children from Sadie's class. One woman demanded she resign, claiming she had lied about her background. Sadie stood firm, but Graham saw the ache in her eyes when she returned home. She said nothing at first, just held his hand tighter, just watched the girls sleep a little longer. Then one night, as rain pressed against the windows, she turned to him and said, "Maybe you should have never met me." He froze. "Don't say that. I brought chaos into your life," she whispered, "into your daughters' lives. You brought color into it. You brought truth. But look at the cost. I would pay it 100 times over," he said, voice rising with every word. "I have lived a life surrounded by people who smiled because they had to, laughed because it was polite. You are the first person who ever made me feel like I didn't have to apologize for being human." Sadie's eyes welled up, and her voice cracked. "I'm so tired of fighting." "Then let me carry some of it," he said. "You don't have to protect me, but I do have to protect myself," she replied. "And I don't know how to do that when the world keeps trying to turn me into a story I didn't write." They stood there for a long time, the space between them thick with fear, love, and everything neither of them had the words to fix. The next morning, Graham brought her to the coast. Just the 2 of them. He told no one where they were going. They drove in silence until the skyline disappeared, and all that remained was sea, and wind and sky. They walked along the beach barefoot, the sand cool and damp. Waves rolled gently onto the shore like breath against skin. "This is where I go when I need to remember," Graham said. "Remember what? That I'm not made of numbers, that I'm not a headline, that I'm just a man who lost himself and found his way back." Sadie closed her eyes and listened to the waves. He continued, "I used to think strength meant never breaking, never showing weakness, but I've learned that real strength is choosing to stand in the open and say, 'This is who I am,' even when it's hard." Sadie turned to him. "What if I'm not strong enough?" "You already are," he said. Tears slid down her cheeks. Graham stepped forward and pulled her close. She didn't resist. She pressed her face against his chest and sobbed quietly, all the fear and exhaustion flowing out of her like a storm. Finally breaking, they stood like that for what felt like hours. And when the wind calmed, and the sun broke through the clouds, she looked up at him. "I want to keep trying." He brushed the hair from her face. "So do I." They returned home changed, not untouched by the storm, but strengthened by it. They stopped checking blogs. They stopped defending what didn't need defending. They focused instead on what was real. Each other, the girls, the moments between. One evening, as the girls played with a puzzle and Graham prepared dinner, Sadie stepped into the kitchen and wrapped her arms around him from behind. She whispered, "I never thought I'd fall for someone like you." He smiled, "And I never thought I'd be lucky enough to have someone like you choose me." She kissed his shoulder, resting her head there, and in that simple gesture, Graham knew the noise would fade. The world would move on, but this was what he would protect. Spring returned to the city like a soft confession. The trees along the avenue outside Graham's townhouse unfurled green leaves with the same quiet certainty that Sadie had come to recognize in herself. It had been 3 months since the media storm had died down. 3 months since people stopped whispering and started looking away again. And in those 3 months, life had quietly, steadily found its rhythm again. Graham no longer wore his suits unless he wanted to. Most days he pulled on a soft blue shirt and walked the girls to school himself. They would each hold one of his hands, their backpacks bouncing as they skipped over sidewalk cracks. Sadie watched them from the window sometimes, her heart wrapped around all 3 of them. Her own life had changed too, but not in the ways anyone might expect. She had not quit teaching, though it would have been easier. Instead, she had leaned deeper into it. The parents who stayed were fiercely loyal, and the children, blissfully untouched by the noise of adult fears, adored her more than ever. In the mornings, she walked through the school doors with her head high and her heart steady. And in the evenings, she returned to a home filled with laughter, warm dinners, and the kind of love that did not need grand gestures to be felt. One Sunday, as golden light spilled across the kitchen, Graham placed a record on the old player tucked into the corner. Soft jazz filled the air. The girls were sprawled on the floor, building towers out of blocks and giggling every time one fell. Soddy leaned against the counter, watching him. "You're humming," she said with a small smile. "I am," Graham replied. "You never used to hum." He walked over and took her hand. "I never used to live." She laughed gently as he pulled her into a slow dance right there on the kitchen tiles. Their movements were quiet, swaying back and forth, his hand at her waist, her cheek near his shoulder. The girls looked up and grinned, then ran over to join. Ava wrapped her arms around Graham's leg, and Clara grabbed Sadie's hand, insisting they all spin. That night, Sadie tucked them into bed while Graham cleaned up dinner. When she returned to the living room, she found a note on the coffee table with her name. "Come to the rooftop." She climbed the stairs, curious. The door opened to a soft evening breeze. Graham stood near the edge, his hands in his pockets. The city behind him glittering like 1,000 quiet promises. Candles flickered around the edges of the space. Not many, just enough to cast a glow. There was no orchestra, no photographers, no dramatic stage, just him, and her. She stepped closer, her heart already beating differently. Graham took a deep breath. "I was going to plan something bigger, flashier, but then I remembered the way you looked the first night we met, laughing with the girls at that diner, hair pulled back, cheeks a little flushed. You weren't looking for a show, you were looking for something real." Sadie's lips parted slightly, her eyes shimmered. "I don't have a perfect past," he continued. "I have made mistakes, I have built walls, and I have hidden behind them. But you walked past every one of them without pushing. You just stood still until I came out." He pulled a small box from his pocket. "I don't want a life that looks good on paper. I want a life that feels like this. Every morning, every laugh, every fight we get through. Every night I fall asleep knowing you're there." He opened the box. A ring, simple, elegant, a single oval sapphire set into rose gold. Nothing flashy, nothing loud, just beautiful. "Will you marry me, Soddy Grace Miller?" Tears gathered in her eyes, but she didn't look away. "You're really asking me this," she whispered. "I've never meant anything more." She laughed through the tears. "You're lucky. I already love your daughters. They love you too," he said. "So much it terrifies me." "Then yes," she said, stepping into his arms. 1,000 times yes. They stayed on the rooftop until the candles burned out and the city grew quiet around them. They talked about wedding plans, but only softly. There would be no ballroom, no stage, just family, and a garden, and a promise spoken under open skies. Month later, they stood in the backyard of Graham's mother's home by the sea. The breeze carried the scent of lavender. The twins wore matching dresses and carried wildflowers they had picked themselves. Leela cried openly. Nathan clapped louder than anyone. Thomas brought homemade bread and refused to leave until everyone had tried it. When Soddy walked down the short path toward him, barefoot, wearing a soft ivory dress that moved like sunlight on water, Graham felt his chest ache. He had spent so many years building empires, managing futures, holding control in his hands like armor, and now, here he stood, letting go of all of that to hold on to the only thing that had ever made him feel whole. After the vows were said, and the rings exchanged, and the girls danced in circles around their feet, Graham leaned close and whispered, "Thank you for seeing me before anyone else did." Soddy touched his cheek, her eyes bright. "Thank you for taking off the mask." They kissed, not like people performing for a crowd, but like two souls meeting in the middle of a lifetime. In the months that followed, the world tried again to pull them into the spotlight. More articles, more speculation, but something had changed. They no longer needed to explain because they had each other. They traveled together, sometimes just to the bookstore down the street, sometimes across the country to introduce the girls to snow for the first time. They laughed, they fought, they made up, they created something that money could never build. A home, not a mansion, not a fortress, not a press-worthy palace, just a home, where love grew, where truth was safe, where the past was forgiven, the present was shared, and the future belonged to all of them. And on one particularly quiet night, with rain tapping gently against the windows, Soddy whispered to Graham as they lay beneath a patchwork quilt, "I used to dream of someone who would protect my heart." He turned toward her, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead. "And I used to dream of someone who would see it." Their hands met under the covers, fingers laced tightly. And the world outside their window kept spinning. But inside that room, time stood still, because real love does not ask for perfection, it asks only for truth, and in that they had everything. In the end, it was not the suit, the status, or the size of his bank account that won her heart. It was the man who dared to show his flaws, who sat across from her with nothing but honesty and hope, and the twin daughters who unknowingly helped him opened a door to something real. What began as a blind date turned into a turning point in both their lives, reminding us all that love cannot be bought, only earned through truth and vulnerability. If this story touched you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and let us know in the comments where you watched from. We'd love to hear your thoughts.